Hello and welcome to the Brutal Iron Gym podcast, where our goal is to cut through the BS and deliver the brutal truth about topics related to health and happiness. Today's podcast is number 1426. The topic is mindset and the title is Progressive Pivoting. So I had a new client. We just started working together this past week, and they were a former college athlete. They kind of had a banged up shoulder through sports, but then they had a very severe knee injury that required surgery. And in their own words, they said they weren't going to turn professional, but that was kind of the final straw that just kind of eliminated that dream for them. And they loved working out. They loved training, so they became a personal trainer. And it's been pretty fun. They've enjoyed it, had a lot of fun in that career. They've helped a lot of other people make progress, but they feel recently that they've kind of lost their own progress along the way. Now, they've tried some rehab programs to try to address their shoulder and their knee, but they struggled with consistency in the training and consistency in nutrition due to their work hours. So they weren't eating enough at all, and they were training, but sometimes they'd miss a training day, or sometimes they'd have to shorten it, or just wasn't kind of consistent as to what the program called for. And they didn't really like the training. They said it was kind of boring. So then they would go back to their full kind of normal sports style training, and then their knee and their shoulder injury would flare up again. They kept bouncing back and forth, and they reached out for help. They basically want to try to find a way to do a rehab routine that isn't boring. And one of the comments the person made was, I kept going back and forth, and I never actually moved forward. We actually started talking about the concept of pivoting, how when you don't see results with one approach, you pivot. You change your approach. But he wasn't applying what he was experiencing within each approach, so he wasn't pivoting with progressions. He wasn't pivoting and moving forward. He was just going back and forth. This is like a person who restrictively eats and over-exercises. They lose body fat and weight, but they plateau before they reach the look that they really want. They can't take more food away because they're already eating so little, and they've added as much exercise and cardio as their packed schedule can already fit, but they still don't see the results they want. So they end up being burned out, having insane cravings. They stop tracking their food because they feel like they're a failure, and the food is just a reminder every day that they can't follow the parameters that they have set. They quit training as consistent or quit doing the cardio as much because they're just burned out, fried, and everything's disappointing, and they feel like a failure. And they think, well, maybe I could just learn to love my body the way it is. But they can't. So they can't accept the weight gain that they start to see, the way their clothes fit, the way they look in photos. So they go back to over-restricting their calories and doing a ton of cardio and exercise. Their weight drops. Maybe they get a few compliments here and there. They feel better in their clothes, but they hit that same plateau again. They're lighter, but not leaner. They have binging cravings every single week, and they feel ashamed and out of control. They're pivoting right back to where they were. Over-restrictive and overactive until they burn out, but then they go right back to being over-restrictive and overactive, almost forgetting that it didn't work the last time. And it's just like the client that went from the rehab program that he didn't nutritionally support right into heavy training, right back to the same rehab program. They pivot when they're not seeing results, but they end up pivoting in circles. They're only pivoting between two options. They're just going in circles, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Now, one online client, another one, a different one, they had made a comment that on social media, it seems like anything works if you're consistent. And in part, that's true. There are a lot of very successful, they're very beneficial ways and approaches to how to eat healthy, how to train right, depending on what results you want. But one of the challenges of social media is you don't always see the truth. You don't see what doesn't work. So all the people who maybe have tried the same approach but it didn't work for them, you don't get to see that because nobody posts that. You don't see what drugs the people are taking. They might say that everything's all natural, but they're full of crap. People do lie. You don't see the lack of balance they have in their life. Maybe they don't have great relationships. Maybe they don't have, great career projection. Maybe everything in their life revolves around their aesthetic, and they're actually pretty damn miserable. You don't see the long-term effect. What they're actually going to be like in 6 to 12 months. The people who over-restrict, can they even sustain that for the long term? Is that something that they can do for the rest of their life? So, like the first two examples of people, there are more than two options. But with the last client, there aren't endless options. So it's somewhere in the middle. So how do you know what to do? How can you break out of pivoting between the same two approaches? Or how can you feel confident in what you're doing when you see so many others doing other things that seem to also work well? What I would do in those situations is to kind of look at the foundation, look at the key elements that we know must be accounted for in order for an approach to work. If any of those elements are out of balance, then we know that that approach likely won't work long term, or it won't work without drugs, or it won't be mentally and emotionally healthy because it might end up having to take over your life in order to account for what's missing. So if we look at some basic things and understand their role and importance and what they need to be, we can then better understand why the two things we're pivoting back and forth don't seem to work well. Or we can help kind of narrow down what we see as overwhelming options and say, okay, it looks like that one might work for now, but it won't work long term. Or that one seems like it's working, but it really doesn't make sense that it's working, so they must be taking some drugs that they're not, saying that they're taking. So the two basic things when it comes to nutrition is calories and protein. You want to make sure that your calories are within a healthy range. If they're over-restrictive, the diet will work initially, but then it will plateau. If you're trying to, say, gain muscle mass without much body fat, and you end up overeating, and especially sporadically eating, where you have periods of overeating and periods of undereating, you're going to gain a ton of body fat with your muscle mass. So we know that calories have like kind of a good range that they need to be in. If you're below that, it's not beneficial. If you're above that, it's not beneficial. Then we know protein is important. Protein is what muscles are made of. So if you're dieting and you want to maintain your muscle tissue, there's a minimum of protein that you have to eat. If you eat under the minimum, your body will start to catabolize, like break down muscle tissue as to provide a source of energy, and therefore you will lose muscle tissue. Likewise, if you eat too much protein, you're going to likely get, like say you're trying to build muscle mass, a ton of muscle mass, and you overeat your protein. You're likely going to end up overeating carbs and fats as well, and you're going to have just a bunch of protein in your system that you don't need. Your body's not going to be able to utilize all of it. You're going to get excess carbs and fats, which will contribute to body fat, and your body's just going to excrete the extra protein. Now, you could say, well, what if I do, everything in protein powder that's a protein whey isolate, or something super lean like a casein that's super lean, very low carbs and fats? Sure, that can work. You can still control your calories in regards to total calories, meaning your carbs and fats. But if your protein is higher than what you really can utilize, there's no point in putting more in there. Your body can't make more muscle mass than what the general process can withstand. So, just to make the analogy easy, let's say your body can make a pound of muscle a day, and that's the most amount of muscle that the body can possibly manipulate and do. Well, if you give enough protein to make a pound and a half, it's not going to happen. The body's capacity can only manage to make 1 pound of muscle a day. So if that was the limit, then putting in more protein doesn't help, right? So our body does have a limit of how much muscle tissue it can create each day. Unfortunately, it is less than a pound. But there is a certain amount of protein that putting in extra doesn't really help. So we know that calories and protein, by the way, I've experimented with these numbers myself. I've dieted with too few of calories and too many calories. I've dieted with too few of protein and too much protein. And I know firsthand the negative effects of all these things. I've done them because I just wanted to know. I wanted to see what it was like. It was awful. So, because you put in a lot of effort and you don't see great results and you're miserable the whole damn time. But I didn't want to have it where, I just read it in a book and I believe it to be true. I know firsthand that if you mess these numbers up, it does not lead to progress. And in one way or another, it's miserable because you either have too low of energy or you're going to the bathroom all the time. It's awful. But I know firsthand. I have tried to diet incorrectly because I wanted to know what it was like, and it's awful. So I know these numbers based on like my education. I know these numbers based on my experience with clients, and I know these numbers based on the experiments with myself. Like I've done this, so I know firsthand through education, through experience, that outside of the proper calorie ranges and protein ranges, you're not going to see better results. Things don't happen faster. On the outside of proper numbers, they slow down, and the process is worse. Now, what are the proper numbers? We talk about that in podcast 1232. It's a nutrition podcast titled Start Here. So you can look at that one, listen to that, and it'll tell you what the proper numbers are and how to set them up for you. Then we have components that kind of impact the quality of the experience of dieting. And that would be caloric distribution. Some people do intermittent fasting where they only eat for 4 hours of a day maybe, and then the rest of the day they try not to eat. Does that fit some people's schedules? Sure. Does that work for some people in regards to a lifestyle balance that they prefer? Sure. Does that help you get the biggest muscles and the leanest you could possibly be? Hell no. It does not match how the body wants to utilize food, so it is not the best approach. But can it take you from where you are now to somewhere better? Sure. Can it take you from where that somewhere better is to the best your possible physique can look? No. But it works. It works for now, And that's something we talk about, like with that client who said they saw so many things on social media that work. It works. How much does it work? Like how long does it work? To what depth does it work? If somebody has a transformation capacity from 1 to 10, maybe that technique gets them from 1 to 6. But then it plateaus, and you need something new to get from 6 to 8, then something new to get from 8 to 9, then something new to get from 9 to 10. We often don't see that part of it. We see a person make progress, but we don't see them be able to make the full progress. And also food selection. If somebody's lactose intolerant, they're not going to eat food that has lactose in it, and that's okay. That helps the quality of their experience, so they're not sick all the time. Some people might prefer to eat, like I, for example, hate oats. And I know every bodybuilder just like that. But yeah, I hate oats. I've dieted off of oats a bajillion times. Can't stand them. I think they taste gross. I don't get very good energy from them and I feel bloated. So I don't eat oats. And guess what? That's okay. You don't have to eat oats if you want to build muscle tissue. There are other forms of carbohydrates. But it's picking foods that like you prefer, picking foods that match your digestion needs, that match your different medical needs, things like that. So food selection is important, and again, that's in podcast 1232. So those are some like just basic elements that can help us understand if an approach we're taking isn't working. Why isn't it working? Well, if it's violating the proper calories, the proper protein, then of course it's not working. So if we need to modify it to get within those proper ranges. So those are kind of foundational elements that need to be accounted for. When you're trying to decide what approach to take when it looks like anything works, look and see the ones that are within proper calorie ranges, proper protein ranges, that have a distribution of calories and protein that you prefer, that matches your schedule, that kind of matches the way the body works. And then also pick foods that you like. There's so much variety to food that you don't have to eat foods you don't like. Then if we look at training, there are 3 elements that I would like you to look at if you want to learn more about. Is podcast number 214, so way back when. And you can go to, if you just Google search Podbean, 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 Brutal Iron Gym, you'll see our Podbean homepage. And on the right side of the page, in the middle of the page, is a search function. You can just search for any one of these podcast numbers and you'll see the podcast you're looking for. So podcast 214 is a training podcast titled Understanding Rep Ranges and Expected Results. So what this means is, if I want to build strength, if I put my muscles under stress load of somewhere around 10 to 20 seconds of maximal force loading, that I can do the movement for at least 10 seconds, but no more than 20 seconds, I am going to produce strength. Doesn't matter what the movement is. There's other consequences to what the movement is. Maybe you annihilate your lower back while trying to work on your legs. There's collateral damage. Maybe you bang up your elbow trying to work on overhead presses in some weird position or something. But when it comes to what exercises you do, the time under tension, which we kind of express and kind of control through rep ranges, is what determines the outcome of that exercise. So that's a foundational element that if you're like, okay, if this style of training looks interesting to me, will it do what I want it to do? Well, do the exercises within that style of training, do they have the time under tensional challenge that matches your desired outcome? If I'm doing something for 40 to 60 seconds, is that going to make me stronger? Probably not. It could improve your technique of the movement, which then can allow you to better express your strength, but that has a very low plateau to it, and then you'll see strength kind of stall out. So it can be challenging to know, okay, did I get physically stronger, or did I just get technically better with the movement? Well, if you plateau very quickly after that improvement, it's probably just the technique aspect. You probably need to still build physical strength. So there are challenging components to understand, okay, if I see results, why? Why am I seeing results? And then if I better understand that, I can then better sustain the results. So podcast 214 is a very good one to listen to. We also have podcast number 220, which is a training podcast titled Muscle Intention versus Movement Intention. And that's very helpful to help understand, okay, should I move explosively with momentum throughout this movement, or should I move slow and controlled without momentum? It depends on the outcome you want. And if you want the outcome that you want, but you're doing the wrong style of training, you're not going to get the outcome that you want from all of your efforts. So that's very important to know. And then you have to have a progressive stimulus to your training. Your training has to progressively get more challenging in some way, whether that's added weight, added reps, different exercise selections, changing the frequency, there's just so much you can change about that. But podcast 657, it's a trainer education podcast titled When Progressive Overload Won't Progress. So that's very helpful to know. So if you're bouncing between two options, and essentially you're just pivoting in circles and you can't find a way out, listening to these podcasts and adjusting one of your approaches to better fit these foundations will help you have a better approach. You might actually see some progress in one of those options that you're trying. If you're overwhelmed with thinking that there are too many options and you're not sure what approach to take, look at an approach that maybe interests you. Listen to the podcast that I mentioned and see, okay, does this approach fit these foundations? Does this approach have the calories and the protein in the right range? Does it account for the right rep ranges and the right type of movement? Should I move with muscle intention or movement intention? How does it progress me over time? If you're just doing body weight movements, you have to do more aggressively selected movements. A basic push-up eventually stops working. Bodyweight squats eventually stop working. You have to find ways to make the movements more intense. So, if you are having trouble pivoting, making changes to what your approaches are when you're not seeing the results you want, but you unfortunately keep changing back and forth between the same two options, stop doing that. And I know that you probably want to stop doing that as well. So listen to these podcasts and they'll help explain why or how to stop doing that. Okay? So if you just keep bouncing back and forth, these podcasts will help you understand what changes to make and how to progress forward. If you're overwhelmed, again, these podcasts will help kind of get you past that feeling as well. Cool. Well, if you have any questions, if you're having any trouble and you're not sure what to do, reach out. Our email is brutalironGym@gmail.com. I'm always happy to help. So I can help kind of look at what you're doing and give you some kind of feedback and what decisions or what choices, what changes might be best for you. Awesome. Well, thank you for listening to the podcast. I really hope it was helpful. If you like our podcast, please consider sharing it. The more people we share it with, the more people we can help, and that's the whole point of this. You can share it on social media. You can share it with a conversation with a friend. Just if you share it, if it's helping you live a healthier, happier life, please share it to others so we can do that for them as well. Thank you to the patrons of the podcast, the people who financially support the podcast. The podcast is well over $1,000 a year. I give an hour to it every single day. I really love it, and I want to keep it for free. And it's only thanks to the people who make donations that it makes any sense for me to do this. So thank you very much. You can consider giving at our website, www.brutalirongym.com. There's options there for one-time donation, monthly donation, yearly donation, anything you can give. We all appreciate it. That way we can all have this podcast to listen to. If you like the information we share in our podcast, you can find more from us on our social media channels on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube under the name Brutal Iron Gym. And if you have any questions, feedback, suggestions, anything you want to know, let us know at our email, brutalirongym@gmail.com. As always, I hope this was helpful, and thank you for listening.